Okay guys, we're going to look at the catalyst for the Civil War. Understand that catalysts are causes. Think of it as stronger than causes. This is a buildup of tension that really results in war being unavoidable. Here are the several catalysts that we're going to look at. All of them, in some shape, form, or fashion, can be tied to slavery. Louisiana Purchase, Missouri Compromise, Wilmot Proviso, Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, Bleeding Sumner, Uncle Tom's Cabin, John Brown's Raid, and Dred Scott Decision. All will lead to the Civil War. Let's see how. First of all, we've already talked about Louisiana Purchase. You know, I like to refer to it often. 1803, Thomas Jefferson conflicted on whether he was able to do it or not, but realized that doubling the size of the United States was just one more step toward his American continent and embracing those agrarian ideas. It doubled the size of the United States, increased the size of the national government, and increased tension over the admission status of states. None of which Thomas Jefferson intended, but that was the result, because this increased tension is going to be over the status of free or slave of every new state, as they have to make that decision when they add them to the United States. Starting with the Missouri Compromise, which we've already talked about, is going to deal with territory of the Louisiana Purchase, the territory that was acquired there. It attempted to solve the problem of slavery, establishing that 3630 parallel as the boundary line. That is the southern boundary of Missouri, and slavery would be allowed south of that, but not north, except in Missouri. Now remember, that line went only to the west of the Louisiana Purchase, not all the way to the sea. The Wilmot Proviso we talked about as being a statement that, or a rider that simply adds to the tension by the fact that it's leaving slavery in that discussion. Okay, what are we going to do with all the new territory after the Mexican War? The Wilmot Proviso tries to add an amendment, or add to an amendment, an appropriations bill saying that it would not allow slavery. Look at this, 1846, it's an amendment to a bill put before the U.S. House of Representatives during the Mexican War. It was passed in the House, but not in the Senate. The Senate adjourned without voting on it. Now, the Senate drew up its own bill later, which would exclude the Proviso. But the Wilmot Proviso created this bitterness between North and South, and it's just really building that conflict. We're still, oh gosh, it's 1846. We're still 14 years away from war here. And it ends up being ignored by the Whig and Democratic parties, these challenges by pro-slavery groups. But some of these are going to be adopted by the Free Soil Party, and then later the Republican Party as it develops in 1856. Now the Free Soil Party, what is it? That small, minimal existence here. 1847, 1848 is when it comes about, and it's really about the opposition to extension of slavery into any new territory. Many of their ideas are going to be absorbed into bigger parties. Think back to civics. What do third parties do? They bring awareness. Why are they not successful? Because the main political parties typically absorb their ideas. We're in a volatile time when it comes to political party system, but that's not what this lecture is about. This is about the catalyst of the Civil War and tying those to slavery. So the Compromise of 1850 is our next step. Compromise of 1850, the background. What are we going to do? Free state or slave state? Okay, the question most addressed is this free state or slave state. And several propose simply leave it to popular sovereignty. Leave it to the states to decide. This opens the question, when should they decide? Before being admitted as a state? When they adopt their constitution? After becoming a state? Should it be done, during that territorial phase? What should they do? When should they do it? With the Compromise of 1850, we have gold discovered at Sutter's Mill. 1849, gold rush. And it becomes necessary to create a formal government in California. So California is in question for statehood. New Mexico, they also needed a proper government. Recommendations were made for both areas to create a constitution, apply for statehood. The question then becomes, do you want to be slave or free? The other challenge with New Mexico is their border dispute with Texas. Still hadn't been settled. And then we have Utah and this Mormon question. Remember I told you before, the only thing more deplorable than slavery was polygamy. And even though the Mormons did not allow slavery, they were not pro-slavery, they did accept polygamy. And so members of Congress did not want to touch that issue. So the focus was drawn to California, a lot to benefit the United States there, a large land area. But that was scary for the South. Constitution was created. It did not allow for slavery. Southerners, that's a huge area to have to contend with. They have a lot of representation. We're going to disrupt the number of representatives in the House. Number in a Senate doesn't matter. It will disrupt the free slave balance there, but it will also increase the number of free state congressmen in the House of Representatives. So to solve the issue, we have the Compromise of 1850. In that, they're trying to appease both sides here. California would be admitted as a free state. Texas, you will be excused from your war debts, and you have to settle your dispute with New Mexico over the border. Now, all new territory below 3630 could enter as a slave state, and that above would in part allow slavery into the new territories. It just depended on the situations there. But one of the issues that seemed so minimal at the time was the stronger fugitive slave law. But it's going to become a major issue later. So looking at the Compromise of 1850, remember 1820 we established the Missouri Compromise right here. This 3630 line, we have Missouri north of that, and this Arkansas territory below that. And then Arkansas becomes a slave state. Texas is also going to be a slave state, but we have this territory in the purple here. What's going to happen to it? It's open to slavery by popular sovereignty, according to the Compromise of 1850. In other words, let the people decide. Now, what does that mean for later? 4 years later, we're dealing with this free state, slave state issue again with Kansas and Nebraska Act. Kansas and Nebraska Act is going to allow for slave or free to be determined by popular sovereignty. You think we've already decided that, but either way, it's going to be decided yet again. It also divides the territory into two states, Kansas and Nebraska. Having two territories would allow a slave-free balance, and we're always struggling for that balance during this 1840s, 1850s period. Well, I guess you could argue 1820s to 1850s period. Kansas-Nebraska Act results. Many in Kansas did not desire to be a slave state. However, Kansas would be bordered on 3 sides by slave states. Think about that for a second. 3 sides by slave states. What can happen with those slaves if they want to run away? Remember what was one of the provisions of the 1850 Compromise. So as Kansas is created as a territory and creates a constitution leaving slavery out of it to be voted on by the people, Missouri gets involved. Missouri is extremely concerned about Kansas being a free state. So what we're going to have now is called Bleeding Kansas. Think through this, okay? At the first election of congressional representatives, 1,700 Missourians are going to cross the border to sway the vote. They're choosing a pro-slavery candidate. March of 1855, the territorial legislature had to be selected. 4,000 to 5,000 Missourians crossed the Missouri-Kansas border for this vote. Over 5,000 pro-slavery votes are cast. Almost 5,000 fraudulent. And Pierce is going to do nothing. Okay, so a pro-slavery legislature passed a strict slave code. How did a state that desired to be a free state end up with a pro-slavery legislature? Because they had Missourians voting for their legislative representatives. So they passed this strict slave code restricting office holding to only those with pro-slavery views. imprisoning anyone who was questioning pro-slavery views, and death for anyone supporting slave rebellion or runaways. They're really pushing this fugitive slave law at this point. And some individuals who were not slaves are going to end up slaves. I don't know how extensive that was. It's certainly worth the research to find out. But the fact is that you had a group of fraudulent voters and angry people, and tension is building. So free state settlers begin to organize. Henry Ward Beecher suggests sending Beecher Bibles. These are going to be guns. Okay, he's basically saying sharp rifles would do more than Bibles at this point to enforce morality. Free state settlers organize a free state party. They hold a constitutional convention, create a constitution prohibiting slavery, and so now we have 2 constitutions in Kansas. These free state settlers established their own legislature in 1855-1856. Pro-slavery voters boycott. To prove themselves that they are not sympathetic to blacks, they adopted an ordinance banning the entry of free blacks as well as slaves. So despite the fact that they wanted to be free, they didn't want to show themselves, they wanted to be a free state, they didn't want to show themselves as sympathetic. So they're hoping to try to minimize the tension at least a little. So now we have 2 constitutions in Kansas, and the question is going to be, which one's legitimate? Historian James McPherson, he does a lot of writing on Civil War history. He wrote The Battle Cry of Freedom and Ordeal by Fire, which are considered go-to books for Civil War study. He describes the 2 Kansas legislatures, one legal but fraudulent, the other illegal but representing a majority of settlers. The Democratic Senate recognized the first, along with the president. The Republican Senate recognized the second, which is legitimate. The first one that was passed using votes from Missouri who had no business voting in Kansas, or the second one where they're trying to outdo and overthrow the first one. Think about that for a sec. Now, we're going to have the Wakarusa War. Okay, November of 1855. Each side begins to mobilize several hundred armed men along the Wakarusa River. It's only going to be a few skirmishes here. It's harshly cold winter, so you have 700 pro-slavery men riding into Lawrence, destroying offices, businesses, newspapers, throwing the press into the river. The house of the Free State governor was burned, as well as a nearby hotel. So we have individuals, vigilantes if you will, taking on this question of slavery in Kansas. This tension is getting out of hand. These actions lead to Bleeding Sumner and John Brown's raid, both of them tied to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, Bleeding Sumner. May 19th and 20th, Charles Sumner speaks to the Senate regarding this crime against Kansas. He uses sexual metaphors of a rape against Kansas. Sumner also made abusive references to Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina. 2 days later, in retaliation for Andrew Butler, Preston Brooks enters the Senate chamber and proceeds to beat Charles Sumner with a cane. He had to be pulled off of him. Think about what this must have looked like in the Senate House with Charles Sumner trapped under his seat. Now, why a cane? When someone is insulted, you challenge them to a duel if they are your equal. If you consider them inferior, a caning is in order. So the caning of Sumner is symbolic. Brooks continued beating Sumner. He had to be pulled off of him. Sumner could not return to his Senate seat for years. But it was saved for him. It was a symbol of the barbaric nature of slavery, and I'm sure it was referred to often. Southern moderates are going to denounce Brooks for his actions. However, others are going to applaud them. Some actually send canes. Due to the Southern vote necessary to expel him, they couldn't get that. So Brooks resigned, but was then unanimously reelected in his district, and he returned. Go figure. It's just the nature of the time period, the tension that it was. John Brown. Crazy looking picture for a crazy looking guy.